right, everybody, welcome back to the COVID-19 version of Beer School. We do virtual here on YouTube channel. Thank you guys very much for tuning in again this week. See everybody kind of chiming in and checking out these videos. And I see you saying, I don't know why you do it. Truth is, I really don't know why, but I thank you. It really helps us out a lot and shows me you guys are connected and hopefully gives you guys a little bit of peace and serenity in this crazy ass time that we're dealing with right now. One of the things I do during beer school is I try to take very complex issues with beer, whether it be microbiology, whether it be agriculture, physics, chemistry, history, tradition, engineering. Beer is really a combination of all those things put together, and those worlds contain a lot of words that are very complex, that are very challenging, words that don't come natural to us if we're not involved in those industries specifically. So what I try to do is take all those words and all those meanings, all the stories, and try to turn them into something that we all can understand. And today's going to kind of go that way as well as we talk about Belgian, the darker ales, the stronger ales, the Belgian strong dark ales. I intentionally did not choose Trappist ales today. I intentionally chose other secular breweries that are doing a really nice job with some of these styles. I really like what they're doing, even though they're not made by the Trappist monks inside the monasteries. They're made by breweries that make beer for profit. Companies actually trying to do a really nice job. We'll get into all that stuff here in just a second. But first of all, let's talk about the flavor of the beers we're trying today, the Belgian dark strong ales. When we talk about Belgian beers, really we're talking about fruit character and spice character, or a balance of those things. Most Belgian brewers believe that if they get the equal parts fruit, equal parts spice, then they have a properly made beer. No spices, no fruits are presumably added to these beers to make them taste that well, to bring them in perfect balance. Most of that character comes from the yeast, and we're going to dive heavy into that conversation in just a minute. The malt characteristics we're going to find in these beers are a little bit more on the simplistic side. Even though these are dark beers, they're going to be made with Pilsner malts, the same kind of malts you make light lagers and American lagers from. But the addition of some other grains, whether it be a special B malt to promote more of a fruitier, a little bit more robust taste, whether it be some darker malts, some carafa malts for color correction, it shifts the color of the beer to a little bit the darker side, so the fruit characteristics are also going to shift to the darker side. So if you think of dark fruits like plums, dates, figs, raisins, those are the fruit flavors you're going to find in a lot of these beers. On the flip side, some of the spice flavors you're going to get hinge on the darker side of spices as well. We talked about the Belgian stronger golden ales a few weeks ago. This is the counterpart to that, the little bit stronger counterpart and a little bit more robust counterpart whenever it comes to character. So the spice characteristics are also going to be a little darker and a little bit more robust. So you can think of things like cinnamon, nutmeg, peppercorns. When I start talking about all those darker fruits, the dried fruits, dehydrated fruits, and start talking about those stronger spices, the darker spices, all of a sudden you start framing the flavors of like a fruit cake. And even though we don't necessarily like fruit cake, we like our beers that taste like fruit cake. So I generally just chalk that up to a character flaw among all of us. The winey notes from this beer also kind of come from the yeast as well. These beers they kind of lie on the fringes, or the yeast kind of hide on the fringes a little bit of a brewer's yeast, but they're not wild yeast either. They're kind of on the fringe of where one meets the other. What that means is these beers have a tendency to produce a whole lot of flavors along with the ethanol character, along with the alcohol character, the fruit and spices being some of them. But the alcohol character of these beers is going to be a little bit more on the tart or acidic side, hinging a little bit more toward those wine-like characteristics. So if you pick up those notes of red wine, don't be surprised. The water profiles of these beers can actually change quite a bit. Each of these brewers traditionally were at the mercy of whatever stream, whatever pond, whatever lake they were near. So whatever characteristics of that water profile near where they brewed the beer really does translate to how the beer tastes. If the brewer was close to a water source that had a lot of mineral content or a lot of buffering power, you actually had a crisper, cleaner, a little drier kind of beer. If the brewery is located near a stream that had a softer water profile, then the fruit characteristics would be softer, the beer would tend a little bit sweeter. Now let's compare these beers to Trappist ales a little bit. Since we have the secular brewers here, One thing I've noticed about most of the breweries that are not Trappist ales, their beers are going to trend a little bit more of that balance to be equal parts fruit and spice. Trappist ales, a lot of times the spice characteristics will rise a little bit and it'll downplay the fruitiness of the beer a touch. So a lot of times your Trappist ales are going to be a little bit more on the spicier side rather than the fruitier side. Also, the Trappist ales usually tend to be a little bit on the drier side. I think that most Trappist ales ferment their beers at a higher rate than what they tell us, or higher temperature than what they tell us, and so that promotes the yeast to stay in suspension a little bit longer and allows the beer to dry out, creating more alcohol, dryness, and a little bit more palatability. The beers we're going to taste today may be a little bit on the sweeter side because they're fermenting a little bit lower temperature, and some other things they're doing. They're probably not adding the beet sugars that you get from a little bit more of a drier characteristics, where the Trappists will use those beet sugars to actually facilitate dryness and a little bit more alcohol production as well. So there's some inherent characteristics that make these beers a little bit different. Trappist ales usually have a little bit more of a hop characteristic to it. Even though none of these beers are considered to be hoppy beers, the Trappist ales have a tendency to use hops at a little bit more greater degree, and that again enforces that spice characteristic to come to the forefront a little bit more readily. Now let's talk about where some of these flavors come from. Let's go back in the time before the microscope was invented, whenever we left a lot of fermentation science up to just a haphazard nature, trial and error, and kind of the place where we are. Whenever you had basically a brewer that would combine all these ingredients, heat them up, they'd eventually separate the grain husks from the sweeter kind of liquid, and that would eventually become beer. They'd boil that. At the end of the boil, it would start to cool, where they put it in a cool ship up in the attics and open the dampers and let the air fly in to kind of cool the beer, or whether they just left it out in the fermentation or the brew kettle and kind of let it come down to temperature very gradually. What was happening at some point, the temperature come down to the point where if you put your finger in there, it no longer hurts. That means if other things were flying in there, like yeast, mold, bacteria, if they fell in there, they probably wouldn't die either. So what you had was these yeast spores that basically fly through these dampers and come and land in that wort or unfermented beer. And they would kind of realize that we're in a new environment. Also went from this dry environment in the air to a liquid environment, and this liquid is full of sugar. All of a sudden, this yeast feels like it hit the jackpot. It's in this whole new universe, and it's just him. However, he looks around and he starts seeing other things falling in there too. He sees some other yeast spores falling in there, and he's like, oh great, I have some buddies here. But he also looks around and says, well, there's some molds, there's some bacteria, and we don't want those. Those are our enemies. They're going to try to gain access to this environment as well, and we can't have that. So the yeast knows what it has to do is replicate very, very fast. So it tries to find a female yeast, right? And so the female yeast and the male yeast, they kind of rub up on each other and try to create some yeasty babies. Truth is, that doesn't happen that way because yeast are asexual. There's no males, there's no females. So if it's going to reproduce, it has to do that on its own. We've all had those lonely nights. We know how that goes. We try our best. But what happens is the yeast kind of knows it has to create babies. So how they create babies is they basically split, okay? What happens is the yeast kind of absorbs all the nutrients from the wort. In other words, it absorbs some of the sweetness, it absorbs the oxygen, some of the trace minerals that are inside there from the water profiles and so on and so forth. And it gets very, very strong. When it gets very strong, it starts to reproduce its guts. We learned like in 4th grade, that stuff is called mitochondria and all that kind of crap. So what happens, that stuff starts to multiply. And as the one set of mitochondria and the other side of mitochondria, and they just not getting along with each other, like brothers and sisters fighting, one set of guts decides to go this way, one set of guts decides to go that way, and all of a sudden, it splits. And yes, it does make a sound. I like to think it sounds like Rice Krispies. Truth is, that's probably not happening either, but I like to think it does. But when that happens, all of a sudden, where that occurs, there's a sore or there's a soft spot. What has happened is that's an access point for other molds and bacteria to get inside of and kill the yeast. It's going to try to eat their guts and kill out the yeast cell. And nobody needs their guts eaten, so we have to protect that somehow. Truth is, right before that happens, that yeast is also creating a whole lot of other chemistry inside that cell, and as it starts to soften that cell wall right before that budding starts to happen, that splitting starts to happen, that chemistry starts to secrete to the outside of that cell wall, and it creates almost a barrier against the other things that are out there in the wort, whether it be bacteria, whether it be mold, or whether it be the acidity that's being created by the fermentation process itself. There's a whole lot of stressors being put on that yeast, so the chemistry that goes to the outside of that cell helps it protect it. You can think of it as like a little bit of a salve or an ointment. So whenever that sore is created, that salve kind of covers that sore and protects it. Okay. After a couple of days, which in a yeast cycle is millennial, the chemistry starts to strip away, and this chemistry starts to float off into the liquid portions of the beer. Turns out the thinning of the beer, the alcohol that's created, the natural acidity that's being generated during fermentation has allowed those things to act like a solvent, and it starts to dissolve all that chemistry away from that cell wall, so it floats away and dissolves into the beer itself. Now, at some point, the yeast realizes, oh my gosh, we've gone through this budding cycle so many times, now our colony's gotten very, very large. We're going to do our best lemming impression, maybe not jump off a cliff, but take a nap. So when that nap happens, all of a sudden the yeast decides, okay, we don't know if we're going to be alive for a couple of minutes or a couple hundred years. Reviving some beers from shipwrecks and trying to propagate the yeast, we realize the yeast can be alive after hundreds and hundreds of years, which is kind of astounding, if that yeast is healthy enough. So what that yeast knows it has to do is it has to create its own health. So as it kind of realizes, okay, we're losing sugars, we're losing oxygen, we're losing trace minerals, we're going to have to go into a self-preservation mode, so we're going to have to take that nap. Before that nap happens, though, the yeast starts to fall dormant and it starts to soak in all of that chemistry they created. We can call those things glycogen stores, or some other things that brewers like to talk about. But really what we're talking about is the organic chemistry that was created by the yeast early in the fermentation process. Now it's reabsorbing that and it's starting to strengthen the cell wall once more. So when it falls dormant, it doesn't turn into a pile of mush. It's actually a living cell, it's just asleep. When it does that, most yeasts that are not Belgian yeast will absorb most of that most of that organic chemistry. It'll absorb all the sulfurs and all the aldehydes and all the esters and all the phenols and all those kind of characteristics that makes the beer maybe taste a little less appealing in most styles. It absorbs those, so whenever that stuff falls dormant on the bottom of the fermentation vessel, the brewer eventually is going to turn on the valve and all that yeast is going to escape, and what you have is clarified or clean beer above that. When it comes to Belgian yeast, it's produced so much of two chemicals that can't possibly reabsorb them all. Those families of chemicals are called esters and phenols. The esters that are left behind are responsible for the fruit flavors in beer, and the phenols left behind are responsible for the spice flavors in the beer. It turns out that the yeast has created so much of that organic chemistry that those are two compounds that it can't absorb that much of. It does absorb some, but not enough to bring the flavors of those two families of chemicals below human thresholds. Those flavors stay above our threshold of flavor, so we taste it. And the brewer feels like, okay, if I've treated my yeast so good during that process, that, is the temperature the right temperature? Is the vessel shape the right shape? Is the volume the right size? Does the pressure build the right kind of way for me? Did I give it the right trace minerals and the right nutrients? Did I ferment, or did I brew the beer properly? And if the brewer feels like that he's done that, then he's going to get equal parts fruit and spice and bring these beers into perfect balance. So that's a little bit of the science behind how fermentation happens, an organic chemistry kind of level. And I hope you kind of enjoyed that, and I hope you took something away from that. The beers we got today are Delirium Tremens, which is our most popular version of the style. I think worldwide this one sells better than any others. If you're looking for a beer that goes a little bit more toward the Trappist style of the fence, look for your St. Bernardus. It might as well be a Trappist ale, but they don't adhere to Trappist rules, so they're not classified as Trappist. Golden's Rock's going to be a little bit sweeter, a little bit more of a port wine kind of flavor, along with all those other kind of Belgian characteristics we've been talking about. Castile makes a sweeter version as well. This is their chocolate quad, a very nice beer with some chocolate added and some coffee added to make it called the barista kind of quality. Unibrew makes a very good variety of these as well from Canada. Because of the low excise tax, you find these to be very affordable. A little bit more on the spicier, toastier clove side of the fence with the Unibrew brands. And Didoli, a little bit more of a mineral-rich kind of characteristic on this, and it really makes the beer a little on the spicier side, a little drier side as well, hinting toward those Trappist styles. So these are the varieties that you can play around with whenever you're considering where these flavors are coming from beer school. Before I let you go, these beers do age particularly well, so get your cellar conditions in the right condition, and then you can age these real well for anywhere from 2 to 10 years. I wouldn't have any problem letting these beers go a little while. You'll see remarkable differences even after 6 months. So if you don't have the patience to go a decade, even 6 months you'll see a big difference. These beers are usually meant for a bigger glass. There's a lot of bubbles. Remember, Belgian beers create a lot of carbon dioxide, and so the carbon dioxide means a big voluminous head, and it means a lot of bubbles. So pour these things in a big wide rim chalice and give it a little swirl and let these beers really open up flavor-wise, aroma-wise, and let the appearance really take hold. And it requires a nice little swirl to get that to happen. Food pairings when it comes to these beers. Again, most Belgian beers, I'll go to the Abbey wash rind varieties of cheeses. So get you a really nice stinky cheese. It smells like feet, but they taste so good. Get those. When it comes to entrees, think of your heartier entrees, whether it be a beef stew or when it comes to spices and the fruit flavors. These beers are really like Asian beef, really well. Korean beef would go real well. Stir fries, those sort of things. Big heavy mushroom gamey flavors can really match up real well to these beers as well. And when you look at desserts, I really, even because these have a really strong red wine component, I really like chocolate with these. So chocolate truffles is kind of one of my preferences, but you can go with a big hearty chocolate cake like a Death by Chocolate cake or any of those. So play around with the beer and food on these. Don't be afraid to lay them down, drink them as is, any way you like. And I hope you guys enjoyed this session of Beer School, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.